Train your damn hip flexors. Benefits of training them are stronger squats, stronger hips, less back pain, and it'll just make you move better as a human.
Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to be discussing best practices for strengthening the hip flexors. Now, there are multiple hip flexors, one of which would be the rectus femoris. That's one of the quadricep muscles. We're going to be talking about that in a separate video, specifically on the rec fem. It's already up on my channel, so be sure to check that out. Rather, we're going to be talking here about the iliopsoas, a small muscle group which you can see pictured on this slide right here. Iliopsoas is a muscle group of two muscles. We have the psoas major and we have the iliacus. Now the psoas major originates off of the lumbar spine. It's going to descend downward in the pelvic cavity and ultimately emerge below the pelvis where it attaches on the lesser trochanter of the femur. Second, we have the iliacus, who sits in the iliac fossa on the internal aspect of the ilium on each side of the pelvis. And like the psoas major, it also extends down distally towards the thigh, and the tendon of the iliacus converges with that of the psoas major as they descend down, and that convergence of the two tendons is sometimes referred to as the conjoined tendon, which then goes, and as we said before, inserts on the lesser trochanter of the femur. Now, these muscles you cannot isolate from one another. Even though they are different muscles within the same muscle group, they work together. So when they contract, they pull on that lesser trochanter, and the resulting motion, which strongly resembles a march, is hip flexion, the primary action of the iliopsoas muscles. And as it turns out, a resisted march or resisted hip flexion, that is one of the best ways to train up and strengthen the hip flexors. Now, before we get into the specific exercises to target these muscles, I want to make one thing really clear. At the start of the video, I showed you that fun little clip that you've probably seen all over the internet. Train your damn hip flexors. They're not tight, they're weak. You have to strengthen them, okay? Tightness, weakness, whatever it is, you do not know that to a certainty unless you've actually had it tested by a qualified professional such as a physical therapist. And to my knowledge, you have essentially four options. You've got pure tightness, pure weakness, tightness and weakness, and none of the above. Okay. How do you know if the iliopsoas is tight? Well, you do a Thomas test. Thomas test will reveal that if it's tight. How do you know it's weak? You do a manual muscle test. If it feels weak, it's weak. Or if you have a side-to-side difference, that side that's weaker is, of course, weak. You could have a situation where it is both tight and weak, but you do not know what the scenario is exactly unless you've had it tested. There are some individuals who just have tightness. It's not actually weak. It's just tight for whatever reason. And will those individuals benefit from simply a stretch? Yes, I have seen it many times. Individuals who have it tight may also benefit from a full range of motion strengthening exercise, not necessarily from the perspective of strengthening, but just working the muscle and getting it exposed to a lengthened part of the range of motion. If it is weak, it needs to be strengthened. And it can just be weak and not tight, in which case strengthen it. If it's weak and tight, it may be that strengthening alone is sufficient and it will loosen up automatically, especially if you're moving through that full range of motion. It may be a situation where after you strengthen it, that person also benefits from a subsequent stretch. You have to see what works for your patient, for your client. Don't assume it's weakness just because some Joe Schmo on Instagram said it was weak. He hasn't seen your hip flexors. He doesn't know. Maybe they're just tight. It could still benefit from a strengthening exercise, but we need to see the whole picture. Never assume. But under the assumption that you have had it tested and they are weak and they need to get stronger, or they're already pretty strong and you just want to get them even stronger, then here's some exercises for you. And I'm going to kind of start with the easier ones and work up to most difficult. And the easier ones are generally speaking going to be open kinetic chain exercises. Here's one of my favorites to start people off with. This is a banded hip flexor march at the wall. I've got a band around both feet and then one leg at a time, of course, because you can't float. You just march the leg up. Now, one of the things you want to make sure to do on any of these exercises is minimize the contribution of the lumbar spine, meaning the rectus abdominis and the obliques. the tendency is to get a little bit of extra lumbar flexion to compensate for weakness in the hip flexors. So one of the things you want to make sure to do is engage your core in some form or fashion to keep the lumbar spine stable so we can better isolate the hip flexors. On a march at the wall, one great way to do this is to, as you are having your hands on the wall, to also simultaneously protract the scapulas. That protraction of the scapulas, and as you do that, it will push your feet further into the ground and force the core to activate to stabilize the lumbar spine. That will in part minimize lumbar movement, especially deflection, so you can better isolate those hip flexors. Exercise number 2, awfully similar to the first one. This is our standing kettlebell march. Now, a few caveats to this exercise. Number 1, whatever foot does not have the kettlebell, I want that foot up on a step. And it needs to be a step of sufficient height to where when your kettlebell foot, that leg extends all the way down, the kettlebell does not ground out on the floor. If it is grounding out on the floor, you're losing out on some of that range of motion of that hip flexor in the lengthened position, so raise the step up a little bit more. The other thing is, if you've got ankle problems or an anterior tib tendinopathy, may not be as comfortable of an exercise, so maybe I would stick with the first one until you get that under control. Because the foot's having to hold the weight of that kettlebell, so it's going to take some pretty good dorsiflexion strength to be able to do that, okay? If you don't have access to a kettlebell, because obviously you can't just hold a dumbbell on your foot like that, you can either get monkey feet like this. This is a really good way to do it. Or if you don't want to invest in that, your clinic, your gym doesn't have that, just get a duffel bag, a small duffel bag, and load some dumbbells or other weights or plates, whatever it is, in the duffel bag, and then your foot can just go underneath the handles there, and then you're golden. With the duffel bag option, you might need a little bit higher of a step depending on the size of the duffel bag, but it still can be accomplished that way. When you're doing this exercise, again, you want to make sure your core is stable. My favorite way to do this is to do it at a squat rack that has a pull-up bar. You can see me doing that. I'm not just holding there, I am actively trying to pull my elbows down towards my side. That act is engaging the core, and it's making it to where I'm much less likely to get lumbar flexion contribution as I march that leg up. That is the standing kettlebell march. Exercise number 3, this is the modified Thomas kettlebell march. Very similar to exercise number 2, but there's some very big differences. The first one is obvious, the position is different. We went from standing in number 2 to supine in number 3 with the leg hanging over the edge. Now, there's a couple things that make this exercise much more challenging than the previous one, meaning you're probably, when you transition, going to want to take the weight down a little bit. In the standing version of this exercise, when you let that weight and therefore your leg come all the way back down, the most that hip's going to be in is neutral. It's not going to be put behind the frontal plane of your body into hyperextension. It just stops in neutral. There's no more tension at the bottom. But in the modified Thomas version, we actually are able to move that hip not only to neutral, but potentially a little bit behind neutral into hyperextension. So we are going to be able to challenge that range of motion a little bit more on this version of the exercise. Difference number 3 is where peak tension occurs during the movement. In the standing version of this exercise, at the very bottom, when we let the leg come all the way back down, there's no tension on the hip flexors at all. We only get tension when we march the leg up, and once the thigh is parallel to the floor, we have max tension. If you march a little higher than that, you lose a little tension, but the point is there's no tension at the bottom in the stretched position. In the modified Thomas version of the exercise, which you see here, at the bottom, not only are we able to move into a little bit of hyperextension behind the frontal plane of the body, but that's also the area where the hip flexors are on peak tension because the thigh is more or less parallel to the floor. So that being said, no one is really concerned about hypertrophy of the iliopsoas, that stretch-mediated hypertrophy, because it's a deep muscle. From a bodybuilding perspective, no one's judging your hip flexor because you can't see it. They're judging your quadricep, they're judging your glutes and your abs, but they're not judging the hip flexors because they're deep, right? They're underneath a bunch of tissue. But hip flexor injuries often occur when they're in their lengthened position. So it makes sense to apply the same stretch mediated hypertrophy principles and get them stronger in that lengthened position. Not only will it make them more resilient against injury, but it will also lead to better flexibility gains because we're challenging the lengthened part of the range of motion. So obviously this version is not for beginners, but it can be if you do it without resistance. But I would definitely, if you're going to load this one up, make sure that you can do exercise number 2 well with no issues before progressing to this version. That being said, it can be an amazing way to build some strength through length for the hip flexors. And then finally, exercise number 4, we're moving away from open kinetic chain to closed kinetic chain. So you've seen me on some of my videos in the past doing GHD sit-ups, and I do those for the abdominal muscles. When you're doing GHD sit-ups for abdominal muscles, we are concerned about letting the lumbar spine extend at the bottom, and then as we come up, we're essentially doing a crunch. So we're allowing lumbar extension, lumbar flexion, lumbar extension, lumbar flexion. As we've said before with hip flexors, we don't want any lumbar spine movement. Now, the core muscles are going to be contracted isometrically, but we want the prime mover, really the only mover here, to be the hip flexors. And so with that being said, I introduce exercise number 4. This is the GHD psoas sit-up. There's other ways to do a psoas sit-up, like sitting on the edge of a bench, putting your feet underneath a couple heavy dumbbells, and then just doing it that way, leaning back and coming back up. But I don't like that as much. It's not as comfortable on my feet. And I actually don't find it to be near as effective as it is on the GHD machine. Now, one question you might have is, what is that stick for? Well, by putting the stick in that position behind my back and then coming under it with both arms like this, what that's doing is it's effectively locking my lumbar spine in one position. You cannot flex your lumbar spine past a certain point with the stick in this position. Go ahead, stand up, put a stick behind your back and try bending forward at the low back. Can't be done. I can extend a little bit, but I certainly can't flex past where the stick is allowing. So what that does is it locks the lumbar spine in position. It still forces the core to have to activate isometrically, but the hips are what are moving. So my hip flexors are now better isolated as the prime mover. You don't have to use the stick, but you have to exert a lot more control against low back movement. This just makes it a heck of a lot easier. And I just do the sit-up as I would a GHD sit-up, but now the prime mover is switched to the Iliopsoas. Very, very good exercise to strengthen the hip flexors. So if you've got tight but still strong hip flexors, can they benefit from doing these types of exercises? Absolutely. Can they also benefit from just doing some simple stretches? Absolutely. You have to find what works best for you. But if in any way these muscles are weak, you need to strengthen them. And in order to determine whether they're just weak or tight or some combination thereof, make sure to check out a qualified physical therapist and they can give you a good assessment on that. Hopefully this video gave you some good choices by which you can strengthen your iliopsoas muscles. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.